do there, children, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks, a journey through American history. I, of course, am your host, Luke Johnson, coming to you from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA, hoping you will enjoy our venture into a topic which is very near and dear to my heart, railroads. I suppose it might be poetic justice that I became interested in steam locomotives and railroads because my grandfather on my mother's side, Charles Timothy Lyons, worked for the AT&SF, or Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, or as it is more commonly known as, the Santa Fe Railroad. He was a proud Irish American, which is somewhat coincidental in the railroad case, as many Irishmen worked for the railroads, laying tracks and pounding down railroad spikes during the railroad construction process, but we'll get to that later. For now, we dive into railroad history. Railroads had existed in England since about the 1560s, and in fact, the oldest operating railroad line in England was started in 1725 and relied on horsepower to pull coal carts. Steam locomotives would not come into existence until roughly 80 years later. In 1802, an Englishman named Richard Trevithick filed a patent on a high-pressure steam engine. Prior to Trevithick's patent, steam locomotives were based on the design of James Watt, who developed the first practical steam engine, and in fact, electrical power is measured in watts because of James Watt. And so now you know what's Watt, or Watt's what, if you will. Anyway, I digress. James Watt's design used low-pressure steam, and because of this, were gigantic. They often took up entire rooms. Trevithick's idea was to make a smaller, more compact steam engine, which relied on high pressure, so that it didn't have to take up an entire room and would be relatively easier to fix. And in 1802, he built a high-pressure steam engine at an iron company called the Coalbrookdale Company in Shropshire, England. And I don't know why, but just saying the name of that town made my mouth feel strange. That is a difficult word to say. Go ahead, try it. You probably can't say it. Anyway, back to the story. To prove his idea could work, he made his steam engine pump water at a measured height. The engine ran at 40 piston strokes a minute with a boiler pressure of 145 psi. And in the back of his mind, Trevithick must have been thinking, you know, if you put that thing on wheels, it could probably run on tracks. And so that's exactly what he did. In 1802, he began work again on a new project. He put the boiler on a four-wheel chassis, which was geared so that the wheels could run. He tested his new invention on February 21st, 1803, outside the Coalbrookdale Iron Works on 3-foot gauge tracks. He later followed this up with the Penny Darren locomotive, which relied on a similar drive system. Rather than the connecting rods being connected directly to the wheels, it was connected to a flywheel on a gear. Sadly, however, Trevithick is not very well known because, sad to say, he applied for bankruptcy in 1815 after his last steam locomotive making venture flopped and he filed for bankruptcy. Which brings us to a man who is often seen as the father of the railroad. His name was George Stephenson. He also happened to work for an ironworks in the old country. And at that ironworks, he created a new steam locomotive that could haul 8 coal wagons loaded down with 30 tons of coal. And 10 years later, he would be responsible for another great historic event. In 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway became the first common carrier railway when George Stephenson built his locomotive, which he called Locomotion. It carried passengers along the Stockton and Darlington line and thus became the first passenger-carrying locomotive. And 2 years later, in the good old US of A, history would be made again. In 1826, the first railroad, called the Granite Railroad, opened in the United States, and I'm sure as you can guess by the name, was used to haul granite in Massachusetts. And 1 year later, in 1827, a much more important railroad would be opened. The first American Common Carrier Railroad. And to anyone wondering what the heck does common carrier mean, it means it carried both passengers and freight. It could be said that the Baltimore and Ohio was destined to be famous from the very beginning. And it could be said the Baltimore and Ohio was destined to be famous from the very beginning. One of the founders of the railroad was a man named Charles Carroll. And if you listened to the first episode of the Bowtie Talks podcast, you would remember was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, and at that time was the last surviving signer of that document. And Charles Carroll said of being one of the founders of the railroad, "I consider this among the most important acts of my life, second only to my signing the Declaration of Independence." Score one for the Irish. And shortly after being built, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad would gain its first steam locomotive. The railroad relied on a man named Peter Cooper to build a new steam locomotive, and that's exactly what he did. He relied on bits and pieces of scrap to build the new locomotive. For example, the flues in the boiler were old rifle barrels. It was a strange looking locomotive, too. The boiler sat straight up in the air rather than horizontally. It later gained the nickname the Tom Thumb because of its rather small size. The engine carried roughly 1 ton of coal, and in terms of real arrangements, was an 022, meaning 2 guide wheels and 2 drivers. Before the podcast ends, you can be sure you will come out knowing something about steam locomotives. The Tom Thumb, as it was called, would later go on to make something of a spectacle in history. As it was making demonstration runs along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and the Baltimore and Ohio was deciding whether or not to use steam locomotives or horses to haul passengers, someone had an idea to race the steam locomotive and the horse. And so that's exactly what they did. Peter Cooper took the controls of the Tom Thumb, and a horse pulled another passenger cart. The Tom Thumb was beginning to look like the winner. However, a belt slipped and the Tom Thumb began to lose power. The horse won. So the horse beat the Iron Horse. The Tom Thumb's career did not last much longer after that, and it was never put into regular service. It was, for all intents and purposes, a demonstration locomotive. An American-built locomotive would not be put into regular service until Christmas 1830. That was when the South Carolina Railroad and Canal Company launched its first passenger train, being pulled by the first American-built steam locomotive ever put into regular service on an American railroad line was launched. The locomotive was nicknamed the Best Friend of Charleston. However, sadly, its career was cut short. On June the 7th, 1831, the Best Friend of Charleston made history again when it became the first North American locomotive to explode. A careless fireman had grown tired of hearing the safety valve whistle, so he decided to tie it down. And this was what led to the Best Friend of Charleston exploding. One thing I've learned: stupidity is inevitable. Some moron is always going to tie down the safety valve and cause everything to go up in flames. The Baltimore and Ohio followed suit in preparing regularly scheduled passenger trains in 1831 when they purchased several vertical boiler locomotives to operate on their line. The Baltimore and Ohio would not use a locomotive with a horizontal boiler until 1837. That was when the company bought a locomotive from the Norris Locomotive Works, which they called the Lafayette. As I said, the engine was the first Baltimore and Ohio engine to have a horizontal boiler, and was also the first the company bought from an outside builder. The Lafayette was a 420, meaning it had 4 front wheels, 2 drivers, and no trailing wheels. The basic layout of the Lafayette was based on a locomotive designed by a man named John B. Jervis. The locomotive was called the Brother Jonathan. However, the Lafayette and the Brother Jonathan differed because of the cylinder placement. The Brother Jonathan cylinders were mounted underneath the boiler frame like many English locomotives, while the Lafayette's cylinders were mounted outside of the frame like most American locomotives. And interestingly, it was because of the cylinder placement of the Lafayette and other locomotives of its type that the 420s built by the Norris Locomotive Works received the nickname One-Armed Billy, because the driving wheels were connected to the pistons by one long connecting rod, which resembled one arm. The Baltimore and Ohio Company, however, was a bit late to the party, as most railroad companies of that time were switching over to horizontal boilered locomotives. One of the most famous examples of this time period arrived in this country in 1831. It was during that year the Camden and Amboy Railroad in New Jersey purchased a new locomotive from Stevenson and Company, and the locomotive was shipped to New Jersey. The locomotive had some pretty rough days during its early tenure at the Camden and Amboy. It was prone to derailing, as the quality of rails were a bit lackluster compared to the rails of England. To combat this, the Camden and Amboy hired a man named Isaac Drips to improve the design of the John Bull. as the locomotive had been called. And that's exactly what he did. He built a two-wheeled cowcatcher to help aid the locomotive through sharp turns. However, by doing so, he had to disconnect connecting rods, and so the engine went from being an 040 to a 420, as the connecting rods were snapped, making the two front wheels guide wheels as opposed to for drivers. Railroads were soon to catch on, and by 1835 there were dozens and dozens of railroad lines all throughout the country. And by 1850 there were over 9,000 miles of railroad lines. Railroad construction, however, began to decline in the 1860s because of the Civil War. Prior to this, railroads had mostly been transportation for the wealthy. During the 1860s, however, it all changed because soldiers needed transportation. Because of this, tickets became more affordable. And the Civil War also gave us not only my favorite piece of Civil War history, but also one of my favorite railroad stories. On April 12, 1862, which just happens to be the day I'm recording this, a group of Union soldiers, led by civilian James J. Andrews, boarded a train in Georgia. Disguised as passengers, the men acted completely nonchalant until they came to the town of Big Shanty. There, while the passengers and crew got out at the Lacey Hotel for breakfast, the group of men stayed behind. They uncoupled the passenger car and left 3 boxcars attached to their train. They immediately started. Their orders were to destroy as much Confederate track as possible and burn rail bridges to halt the supply line of Confederate goods. As the locomotive began to roll, conductor Andrew Fuller ran out of the hotel only to see his locomotive was being hijacked. He began to chase them on foot, but later commandeered an older locomotive called the Yonah. After the Yonah, he was able to gain another locomotive called the Texas, which was facing the wrong end at the station, and began to chase the other locomotive called the General backwards. The chase lasted 87 miles and 7 hours as the General began to run low on fuel and water. Many men tried to escape, but 23 were captured. And this is historically significant because this was the first time the Medal of Honor was ever given. And it was also during this time the United States began to make a connection of railroads, and this, of course, led to the Transcontinental Railroad. The tracks were first laid in 1863, and it took many, many men to lay the tracks and blow out mountains, build bridges for the Transcontinental Railroad, and most of them were immigrants. As I said during my first podcast episode, a lot of Irishmen found jobs during westward expansion for this very reason. They were laying tracks, spitting rails, and cussing and singing every mile. Took the Chinese, too. Many Asian men found laying tracks as well. It was dangerous work, and I don't even want to begin to think about how many lives were lost building the Transcontinental Railroad system. But it all paid off, because on May the 10th, 1869, the final spike was laid when the Union Pacific No. 60 Jupiter and Central Pacific 119 met at Promontory Point, Utah. That gave way for decades and decades of rail transport until airplanes came along. As you can tell, the United States has a very storied history of railroads. They've also came up with some of the most interesting steam locomotives. And a specific reel arrangement is even called the American type locomotive. That is the 440. 4 guide wheels, 4 drivers, and no trailing wheels. Not too many of this type survive today, unfortunately. However, one of the most famous is perhaps the Virginia and Truckee Inyo in Nevada. It's appeared in many Western movies, and in fact even appeared as the Texas in the Disney movie The Great Locomotive Chase. And on the subject of films, perhaps the most famous movie star locomotive is the Sierra No. 3. It starred in well over 100 movies. It was the locomotive in Back to the Future Part 3, and it was also the Hooterville Cannonball in Petticoat Junction. And another famous American locomotive class is, of course, the Union Pacific Big Boy, which is the largest steam locomotive ever built. The Big Boy class weighed 604 tons and measured 132 feet from smoke box to coal tender. 8 of these locomotives survive, and 1 is currently operating under its own power. And I have seen it in person, and it is massive. I mean, a picture cannot even measure up to how it looks up close. Well, folks, that about wraps up all our time here at Bowtie Talks. I hope you've enjoyed our little journey into American railroad history, and I'm glad I didn't get sidetracked. Oh, come on, people. That was a good pun. You gotta give me that. Well, until next time, I'm Luke Johnson, and this has been Bowtie Talks. Goodbye, and God bless.